Happy Thursday, everybody. My name is Steve, and welcome to Rank the World, the podcast where a young white guy shares what he thinks about a variety of topics in a tier list format, because that's exactly what the world needed more of. Now, for those of you listening for the first time, this is what I like to call a homemade podcast, meaning I'm not recording in a full studio. I do use a nice XLR microphone with an audio interface, but that's just about where the list of professional equipment ends. I'll do my best to minimize background noise, but if a bird flies out of the sky, or a train decides to wave hello, or my neighbors start jumping up and down while I'm in the middle of talking, I'm not going to start the whole thing over. Sound like a deal? Okay. And one last thing before we begin. If you enjoy this podcast and want to see more of what I make, go check out my Linktree at linktree/DareHairSturm. That's linktr.ee/DerHerSturm. That's got links to my Twitch, YouTube, Redbubble, and Twitter, where you can stay up to date with what I'm doing and when I'm doing it. Definitely not the same sort of content as you can listen to here, but who knows? You may find a thing or two worth enjoying. Now, with that out of the way, let's get started. Now, if memory serves correctly, March 3rd, 2017 was the day that one of the, maybe not one of the most revolutionary, but one of the best-selling video game systems was ever released, the Nintendo Switch. Now, for such an occasion, I was thinking, this is such a widespread platform that was released 6 years ago now. I wonder how it would stand up against all the other prominent and noteworthy handheld and console releases of history. Because really, when you get down to it, that's what the Nintendo Switch is. The perfect medium. Well, not perfect, because it does have its issues, but as perfect as we've ever had to a merge between the traditional couch experience of a console and the on-the-go experience of a handheld. Now, there are some that I unfortunately won't be able to talk about, stuff that I don't really have too much experience with, primarily the stuff Atari makes, pretty much everything before the first Nintendo Entertainment System. And without further ado, let's start with that, the Nintendo Entertainment System. Now, to its credit, it did save the industry from the video game crash of the early 80s. Back then, a lot of hardware manufacturers and video game publishers did not have a whole lot of control over the quality of their product. And as such, the market really got inflated with low-quality, buggy, broken games. One of the most egregious of which now has thousands and thousands of copies buried in the Nevada desert, E.T. for the Atari 2600. In 1985, Nintendo came in and sort of fixed things up a little bit. They distanced their product, the Nintendo Entertainment System, from the word video game, primarily because of that crash that was caused by the market previous. And along with that, it pioneered a great number of genres, platformers, Metroidvania-style games, all of them first called the Nintendo Entertainment System home. However, this console platform is not without its age. Its control system, as well as the controller shape, are very outdated. So too are the build qualities of the games themselves, as well as the build quality of the system itself. I think it's very telling that the original design, the front-loading design, got changed later on in the system's life cycle. And that's because it just the way that the mechanism was built, there were a lot more issues than a top-loading cartridge system. A lot of really prominent franchises were born on this platform: Super Mario, The Legend of Zelda, Metroid. So although it is a very important piece of console history, I don't think it is held up too well by today's standards. So for all those reasons, the Nintendo Entertainment System will be placed in C tier. Next, we have Nintendo's first handheld, the Game Boy. Similar story here as with the Nintendo Entertainment System. It was the first handheld system to have interchangeable cartridges. You didn't have to buy a new system for every game you played, unlike the Game & Watch series. However, a lot of comforts that we take for granted today were not present with this system. Very small display, wasn't a color display, wasn't backlit either, so you could only really play this in direct sunlight. But although, to its credit, much like the Nintendo Entertainment System, it not only gave supplements to some of the franchises that the NES gave birth to, with entries like Super Mario Land 2 and Link's Awakening and stuff like that, but it also had a couple killer applications of its own, namely Tetris and Pokemon Red and Blue. So I think all things considered, unfortunately I can't in good conscience put it any higher than C tier. Next, we have the Sega Master System. Pretty much the same boat as the NES and Game Boy, except it doesn't have a whole lot of credit to give in terms of innovation, in terms of giving birth to franchises that would really become prominent in the future that the previous two platforms we've discussed have. So I think for those reasons, the Sega Master System is a D-tier console. Next, we have the Sega Game Gear. Similar story to the Master System again, although it did have one key point of innovation, a color display. If memory serves correctly, no other handheld video game platform before had a color display, and at least for the time, it was a really good one. Still has some of the same problems in terms of killer apps that the Sega Master System did. It didn't have a whole lot, although to its credit, it was decently more ergonomic than the Game Boy. But that also came at the price of it weighed a lot more, and with its color display, it did not have nearly the battery life that the original Game Boy had. All things considered, it lands into D tier. It just can't make it out. Next, we have Sega's best console, the Sega Genesis, or abroad it was the Sega Mega Drive. If memory serves correctly, this was the first 16-bit system to hit the market, and although it wasn't quite as powerful on a lot of fronts as its direct competitor would be later on, the Super Nintendo Entertainment System, it did have some decent power behind it. It had a really memorable library, really memorable ad campaigns, and overall was a really good contribution to the history of video game consoles as a whole. Admittedly, this legacy is tarnished a little bit by how they tried to prolong it at Sega instead of, what you would normally expect, good software support. Instead, it got a couple hardware add-ons with the Sega CD and the Sega 32X, which pretty much, if you use them, made it look like a console on life support. It had a good deal of hardware revisions, mainly just changing up the physical form factor of the console, and all things considered, although it did give birth to one of the most infamous game franchises of all time, Sonic the Hedgehog, it did have a good amount of problems that it makes it so it can't go any higher than B tier. On the other hand, we have the Super Nintendo. Although it didn't have quite as distinct of a sound to it, in almost every other regard, it surpassed the Sega Genesis in terms of abundance of quality titles, in terms of the controller and control schemes. This was the first controller to have a sort of ergonomic shape to it. Well, no, that's not true. That was the Sega Genesis, but this was the first controller to have not just 4 total face buttons, but also shoulder buttons as well. So that opened up a wide variety of possibilities that developers could use when designing their games. You've got classics like Super Mario World, A Link to the Past, Super Metroid, Star Fox, really all around a very solid console. So for those reasons, the Super Nintendo is an A-tier platform. Next we have the Sega Saturn. one of the most unorthodox and difficult to develop for platforms in console history. Although, to its credit, it did have a phenomenal controller design. It did not have the software support or really the development support from Sega for very long. As much potential as this console may have had, their developer really jumped ship from it very quickly. And although I don't think that was unwarranted, I do think it is a crying shame that that happened. So I think for those reasons, unfortunately, the Sega Saturn is a D tier entry. Next we have the Sony PlayStation. Sort of interesting history behind it. It was initially conceived to be a CD add-on accessory for the Super Nintendo, a disk drive system. Unfortunately, the business deal behind the project fell through, and Sony instead dedicated their hardware research into making their own console, the PlayStation. A lot of really good franchises were born with this system. Tomb Raider, although it wasn't born with it, Final Fantasy as a series had really good entries on this system. Crash Bandicoot. This was one of the first systems to really go into the ergonomics with its controller design, not only with the original gamepad, but also the DualShock, which was also the first controller to have dual analog sticks, a staple in controller design that a lot of people take for granted these days. And all in all, another really solid system. And I think that definitely shows with its sales figures. For a while, it was one of the best-selling systems of all time. So I think all things considered, the Sony PlayStation is another A-tier console. Next, we have the Nintendo 64. I'm not entirely sure what the design philosophy was behind the Nintendo 64's three-pronged controller. I guess it was supposed to allow for multiple ways to control games as well as holding the controller. Me personally, I'm interested that they had such an unorthodox design, but I don't really care for it. Yet at the same time, this console was an opportunity for a lot of beloved franchises to get their first foray into 3D. Entries like Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time, Super Mario 64, Donkey Kong 64, as well as a handful of new IPs and cult classics like the Banjo-Kazooie series, Conker's Bad Fur Day, GoldenEye. Although admittedly, the controller design and the performance of the Nintendo 64 has shown a good amount of its age. So I think all things considered, although it is not a bad platform by any means, I can't in good conscience put it any higher than B tier. Next we have Sega's final foray into the console wars, the Sega Dreamcast. On paper, it was a really solid device. A decently ergonomic controller, really good software support behind it, a nice clean aesthetic design unlike anything Sega had done before. But unfortunately, although it may have had a good amount of potential, it simply wasn't meant to be. As pressure from Sega's competitors a bit into the Dreamcast's life really started to build up against it, after 2 years the console got retired and Sega stopped making consoles. So although the console is home to a good number of cult classic titles like Sonic Adventure 1 and 2, Crazy Taxi, Jet Set Radio, maybe if it had had a full life cycle it would have been placed higher, but for now, the Sega Dreamcast is a C-tier console. Next, we have the Sony PlayStation 2, which to this day is the best-selling video game console of all time, or at least when this episode was recorded. And it sold well for a good reason. It had very solid software support, not only from the first party, from Sony themselves, but also from third parties. You had cult classics like the Lego Star Wars game, as well as entries from older series like Tomb Raider, as well as completely new ones like God of War. Not even to mention, at the time of its release, the PlayStation 2 was one of, if not the cheapest, DVD players on the market. So it had a really big opportunity there. Its competitors like the Dreamcast, the GameCube, and the Xbox simply could not do that. The Xbox may have, but that came a good couple years. Actually, I think it was 3 years after the PlayStation 2 came out, so it had a decent head start. Its controller didn't iterate too much from the previous DualShock, but then again, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. So I think all things considered, the PlayStation 2 will be our first S-tier entry of the day. Next, we have the Nintendo GameCube. Unfortunately, this console didn't do so well in terms of sales. And apart from the medium that Nintendo chose to have this console run, being a mini DVD, a really unorthodox media source, I can't really imagine why the console did so poorly. Because out of the 4 that were released in its generation, in terms of quality of software, I think objectively Nintendo comes out on top. It had cult classic entries like Luigi's Mansion, it had Super Smash Bros. Melee, which, even though I'm not a fan of Melee, it is still one of the most critically acclaimed party and fighting games of all time. A slew of Mario Party games, one of the most critically acclaimed Mario Kart games of all time, Super Mario Sunshine, 2 Metroid Prime entries, and much, much more. Not to mention, one of the most unorthodox, but in a good way, controller designs in history. A controller design that is still commonly used by Smash Brothers enjoyers to this day. Comfortable to hold, ergonomic placement of the buttons. Admittedly, one of the worst D-pads I've ever used, but other than that, a really solid controller design. So I think all things considered, the GameCube 2, shoot. I really want to put the GameCube in S tier, but I can't in good conscience knowing what we're going to be talking about later on. So for now, the GameCube is an A tier entry. Next we have Microsoft's Xbox. Not quite as noteworthy of a release in its generation as its competitors, but it still had a heavy swing behind it. Titles like Halo, and that's all that can come to mind right now, although I am certain that there are plenty of good quality software titles that were released for the original Xbox. And I think above all else, it had a decently distinct personality to it. Not only in terms of its marketing, but also just the design of the system itself, as well as its controller. So I think all things considered, the Xbox is a B-tier console. Next we have Nintendo's Game Boy Advance. At this point in handheld console history, Nintendo was pretty much ruling unopposed, and that wasn't for no reason. Pretty much, the Game Boy Advance felt like a portable Super Nintendo with extra power behind it, where the Super Nintendo had expanded a lot on beloved franchises that the Nintendo Entertainment System had begun. The Game Boy Advance really advanced them further. Really solid entries like the Super Mario Advance series, Metroid Fusion, the Mega Man Zero series, not even to mention Pokemon Ruby, Sapphire, Emerald, Fire Red, and Leaf Green. Not too much else to say here. All around, a solid A-tier release. Next, we have the Nintendo DS. Now, initially, when the platform launched in 2004, it had a really bulky design. However, with later hardware revisions like the DS Lite, the DSi, DSi XL, it really streamlined the form factor and let the platform really come into its own in terms of a design aesthetic and a personality. The first 2 releases, the DS and the DS Lite, had backwards compatibility with the Game Boy Advance, which at that point had a huge library of quality titles. Unfortunately, unlike the Game Boy Advance, it was not also backwards compatible with Game Boy Color and Game Boy games, but that wasn't too big of a loss to be had. As of recording, it is the second best-selling hardware release in video game history, and for really good reason. Even though it had a really unorthodox, at the time, layout of screens, two on top of each other, with the bottom being a touchscreen. There were a lot of titles that utilized its hardware really well, whether it be entries like Sonic Rush and Sonic Rush Adventure that would switch between the two displays for the gameplay, games like the Pokemon entries that would use the bottom screen for minigames and menus, or games like Kirby Mass Attack and Kirby Canvas Curse that would use the touchscreen for its control style. All around, there were a lot of really fun, original experiences to be had with the Nintendo DS. And I think for all those reasons, the Nintendo DS is an S-tier console platform. Next, we have Nintendo's first challenger in the space of handheld gaming, the Sony PlayStation Portable. Objectively, this was a much more powerful platform than the Nintendo DS. However, whether it was the medium in which media was shared, a miniature disc, I think it was called the UMD system, where it was like small discs put in cases that you would put into the back of the system, whether it was just the translation of Sony's design aesthetic translating to a handheld format, I'm not quite sure what it was. But the fact of the matter is, this handheld did not nearly perform to the standards that Nintendo's hardware had set. So I think although it did have solid aspects about it, a lot of really good higher fidelity titles were released for it. It was a very good music and movie player. I can't in good conscience put the PlayStation Portable any higher than B tier. Next we have Microsoft's Xbox 360. This thing was a titan of its generation. It really solidified Microsoft as a household name in terms of video games. Really solid third-party support, which primarily was because of how good the controller was and how easy of a platform it was to develop for. And at least to me, what I think the most important contribution of the Xbox 360's life cycle was how indie games were able to live on it as a platform. You had classics like Castle Crashers, Super Meat Boy, Battle Block Theater, Spelunky, all were able to thrive in a console world because of the Xbox 360. Not even to mention the culture that was able to develop, although that culture was contributed to also by entries like the PlayStation 3. It really thrived on the Xbox 360 in terms of social interaction and as well as online multiplayer. So I think all things considered, the Xbox 360 is an S-tier console release. Next we have the Nintendo Wii. Although it did have a good amount of backwards compatibility and therefore a good amount of synergy with the GameCube, I think this console's strongest point was how accessible it was for the average person. By far, the Wii was the most successful implementation of motion controls in console history, and seeing as it was the best-selling platform of its generation, as well as one of the best-selling platforms in console history, I think the Wii tapped into that potential really well. Much like Nintendo hardware that had been released before it, a lot of further evolution and iteration of its beloved franchises were able to grow here on this platform. You had entries like Super Mario Galaxy, Kirby's Return to Dreamland, Legend of Zelda Skyward Sword, as well as many, many others. So I think for all those reasons, the Wii is another S-tier console. Next we have the Sony PlayStation 3. Although out of the three consoles that were released in its generation, it was the most powerful. Because of the hardware architecture behind it, it was the most difficult to develop for. And I think because of that, the quality of third-party titles, as well as the amount of third-party titles that were released for it, were simply not able to compete with the likes of the Xbox 360. Admittedly, it did have a good number of killer apps from its own in-house developers, such as more entries in the God of War series, The Last of Us, Metal Gear Rising Revengeance, among many others, I can't in good conscience put the PlayStation 3 any higher than A tier. Next, we have the Nintendo 3DS, which, in Nintendo fashion, threw another really unorthodox innovation into the mix, with glasses-free stereoscopic 3D. Now, when the platform originally launched, its gimmick didn't work amazingly. It worked, and when it worked pretty well. But there were some issues, like you had to hold it in a certain way in order for the 3D to really work. When it first launched, the price was obscene. But as the platform matured through its life cycle, a lot of these problems were solved. Got a price drop, further hardware revisions, utilized technology that it was much more difficult for the stereoscopic effect to be broken. And really, because of the software library that was behind it, really solid entries like Mario Kart 7, Super Smash Bros. For 3DS, New Super Mario Bros. 2, as well as remakes of older classics like Ocarina of Time 3D, Majora's Mask 3D, Star Fox 64 3D, not even to mention other quality titles like the Pokemon entries that were released for this system that we discussed last week, the renaissance of the Fire Emblem series, at least here in the West, not even to mention the adoption of releasing much older classic titles from not only Nintendo's past, but other platforms like Sega's past as well, through Virtual Console. Really, in my opinion, one of the best handheld ecosystems in console history. So I think for those reasons, I will be placing the Nintendo 3DS in S tier. Next, we have Sony's PlayStation Vita. I think this console was ahead of its time. In terms of power and quality of its titles, it was in a weird sort of halfway point between the PlayStation 2 and PlayStation 3. I think if this platform had launched 2 or 3 years later, it would have done a lot better than it did. But unfortunately, because of high costs to develop for, high entry cost for the consumer, as well as because of the high development cost, low amount of software. Although the Vita did have a lot of really good points, like a nice build quality and design, a nice, beautiful OLED display, unfortunately the deck was stacked against it. And the fact that it used a really expensive proprietary memory card format did not help it in the slightest. So unfortunately, I will be placing the PlayStation Vita into D tier. Next, we have the Nintendo Wii U. I personally liked it, but objectively, it was not very good. Although it did have a lot of really good titles on it, like Super Smash Bros. For Wii U, Mario Kart 8, Nintendo Land, Splatoon, it unfortunately fell victim to a very bad marketing campaign and underutilization of its unique hardware. Because with every Nintendo release, there's some sort of hardware gimmick to it, like the 3DS's stereoscopic 3D, the Nintendo 64's controller, Nintendo Wii's motion controls. It had what it was called a gamepad, pretty much a controller with a screen on it. And what it served to do was, one, for a lot of titles, you could play them on the gamepad screen instead of the TV screen. It could allow methods of synchronous but divergent forms of gameplay. For example, in one of the launch titles, New Super Mario Bros. U, one person could play with the gamepad and spawn in platforms and blocks, while everyone else played on the TV, the normal platformer. You could use it for motion controls, the gamepad itself for games like Splatoon. All in all, it had a decent amount of potential that never really got realized. So I think for all those reasons, although it does have some good things about it, it will be our first F-tier console of the day. Next, we have Microsoft's Xbox One. Now, although the build-up to release was filled with a lot of controversy, this ended up being a very solid console. It didn't end up doing a whole lot that the Xbox 360 didn't. other than just performing a lot better. And really, that's about all I have to say about the console. It was just a really improved and refreshed Xbox 360, and that's about it. So I think for all those reasons, although it's a solid platform, it didn't really iterate much from its predecessor. So for those reasons, it is a B tier console. Next, we have the PlayStation 4, which, although similarly it didn't iterate a whole lot from the PlayStation 3, I feel it did enough to really set itself apart from its predecessor in a lot of ways, especially with its first-party releases. You had games like Last of Us Part 2, Until Dawn, God of War, Bloodborne, and all around was a very solid platform for its time. So I think for those reasons, the PlayStation 4 is an A-tier console. Next, we have the Nintendo Switch, the inspiration for today's entire episode. Although it is not nearly as powerful as its peers, the time that it was released and even to this day, it was the first real hardware experience in a portable format. Although it doesn't nearly boast the portability or the longevity, and by longevity I mean like battery life, of its predecessors like the DS or the Game Boy or the 3DS, it is a really healthy balance between hardware-like performance based on standards set by the Wii and Wii U, while still having a good amount of different ways to play because of its controller scheme. Now, to its detriment, a pretty prevalent design flaw with its Joy-Con controllers that would lead to misinputs, drifting inputs, that still to this day have not been properly fixed. But other than that, it is a really solid platform with really solid entries. Games like Zelda Breath of the Wild, Pokemon Scarlet and Violet, Super Mario Odyssey, Metroid Dread, Metroid Prime Remastered, not even a full month ago. And if you ask me, it's still going decently strong. So I think all things considered, the Nintendo Switch is an S-tier platform. Next, we have Microsoft's Xbox Series X. Now, although in terms of aesthetic, it doesn't iterate too much from the Xbox One, in terms of performance, it very much does. While the Xbox One was really an HD console, the Series X is a 4K, possibly 8K, I might have to double check on that, but definitely a 4K console. Although it is still a developing platform, it is decently young in its life cycle, it still has a decent amount of good software behind it, such as Halo Infinite, a lot of other third-party releases, as well as the service Xbox Game Pass. It's a subscription service that lets you play a huge variety of games that are available on the platform. So I think all things considered, the Xbox Series X is an A-tier console. And then finally we have Sony's PlayStation 5. While it has almost all of the pros that I just discussed with the Xbox Series X, while being just a bit more powerful, it also has a lot more killer applications behind it. Games like Last of Us Remastered and God of War Ragnarok, as well as Spider-Man Miles Morales, as well as Spider-Man 2, which will be coming down the line. Although it is a monster of a machine, truly massive, I know it won't fit in any TV stands that I have, it is a really solid platform. So I think for those reasons, it is an S-tier console. Now, before I wrap things up, I am going to be adjusting some entries here. I'm going to be moving the Sega Genesis down to C tier, the GameCube down to B tier, the Sony PlayStation 3 down into B tier. I will be moving the DS and the PlayStation 2 down into A tier, the PlayStation Portable down into C tier, and then finally the Sega Saturn down into F tier. So, to reiterate today's results, in F tier we have the Wii U and the Sega Saturn, In D tier, we have the Sega Master System, the Sega Game Gear, and the PlayStation Vita. In C tier, we have the Nintendo Entertainment System, the Game Boy, Sega Dreamcast, Sega Genesis, and the PlayStation Portable. In B tier, we have the Nintendo GameCube, PlayStation 3, Nintendo 64, Xbox, and Xbox One. In A tier, we have the Super Nintendo, PlayStation, Game Boy Advance, PlayStation 4, Xbox Series X, Nintendo DS, and PlayStation 2. And in S tier, we have the Xbox 360, Nintendo Wii, Nintendo 3DS, Nintendo Switch, and PlayStation 5. And that's about it for this episode. Thank you all so much for tuning in. If you enjoyed, feel free to follow the podcast on your platform of choice, including Spotify, YouTube, Pocket Casts, and Anchor. I will be back next week with another new topic, but until then, you all have yourselves a damn good one.